Rustlers had left him for dead, and Willa Sutter was very nearly the one person in the territory with cause to leave him that way too. She found him by accident, hauling a bundle of mending down through the Box Canyon trail that cut a full 2 miles off her walk into Rincon, and stopped so short at the sight of him roped to the dead cottonwood at the canyon's bottom that bundle slid clean off her shoulder into the dirt. Darl Prentice hung slack against the ropes, chin to his chest, his shirt dirt dark with blood at the shoulder where a bullet had grazed him, his face swollen and bruised where someone had beaten him for information he had plainly refused to give. He did not look like the hard, unforgiving rancher who had stood on his own porch 6 months back and told her, in front of half his outfit, that a thief had no business drawing another day's wages from him. He looked, just then, like a man who was going to die if somebody didn't do something in the next quarter hour. Willa stood a long moment in the canyon's thin morning light, feeling the old hurt rise up in her fresh as the day he'd fired the accusation, unproven and never once questioned. That she had lifted $40 from the ranch strongbox, the way the whole town of Rincon had looked at her differently after, as though 6 years of honest work counted for nothing against one man's say-so. The months since spent scraping by on laundry and mending, because no other outfit in the county would risk hiring a woman Darl Prentice had called a thief. She had every reason in the world to walk on past him and let the desert finish what the Rustlers had started. The memory of that firing came back to her whole and sharp, standing there in the canyon's thin light. She had been in the ranch kitchen kneading bread when Foreman Rock came through with 2 of the hands trailing behind him, like witnesses summoned for a hanging, and Darl close on his heels, jaw already set the way it set when he had decided something and would not be moved from it. $40 gone from the strongbox, Rock had said, and no one else with cause or opportunity but the woman who cleaned the office twice a week and knew where the key was kept. Willa had said plainly that she had never once touched that box, had never had reason to need $40 badly enough to risk 6 years of honest wages, and a good name besides, but Darl had not asked her a second question. He had simply looked at her, weighed Rock's word against her own, and found hers wanting. "Pack your things," he'd told her, not unkindly but final as a closing door. "I'll not have a thief under my roof, whatever her reasons." She had walked the 4 miles into Rincon that afternoon with her whole life in a single carpetbag, and had not, in the 6 months since, managed to shake the particular shame of being disbelieved by a man whose good opinion she had not even known, until she lost it, how much she valued. She did not. Cutting him loose took longer than she liked, her hands unsteady with the rope's stubborn knots and her mind racing ahead to everything that needed doing after getting him off the canyon floor, getting him somewhere out of the sun. Stopping the bleeding at his shoulder before he lost any more of himself into the dirt. He came half-conscious as the last rope gave, groaning, and his eyes, when they finally focused on her face, went wide with something that looked, for one terrible instant, like fear. "You," rasped. "Come to finish it. I've come to get you out of this canyon before you bleed to death in it," Willa said, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against his shoulder, refusing to let his words land the way they wanted to. "You can thank me or curse me once you're not dying, Mr. Prentice. I haven't got the patience for either right now." "Why," he managed, through gritted teeth as she worked, "would you after what I—" "Because I'm not the kind of person you decided I was," she said, and there was more steel in it than she'd intended, 6 months of swallowed anger finding its way out sideways. "Now hold still, unless you'd rather I leave the rest of this conversation for when you're not liable to pass out from moving your mouth." He held still. Was, she thought grimly, likely the first order he'd taken from her without argument in the whole while she'd known him. Getting him out of the canyon and the 2 miles to her small rented house at the edge of Rincon took the better part of the afternoon. Darl slumped half-conscious across the saddle of his own horse, which she found grazing loose a quarter mile off, while she led the animal on foot and kept one hand always on Darl's good shoulder to steady him. By the time she got him inside and onto her narrow bed, sweat had soaked clean through her dress and her arms shook with the strain of it, but the relief of simply having walls around them, a door that locked, a roof between him and the sun, loosened something tight in her chest. She cleaned the wound at his shoulder properly, then a graze, ugly but shallow, the bullet having only kissed the flesh before passing on, and bound it with clean linen, and did what she could for the bruising at his face and ribs, and through it all he watched her with a wary, exhausted confusion that told her plainly he had not yet worked out why a woman he'd wronged was bent over him with such careful hands. "Rustlers hitch you," she said when his eyes were clear enough to hold a conversation. "How many?" "3. His voice was thin but steady enough now. "Came on the herd near the south fence line before dawn. I rode out alone to head them off. Fool thing to do. I know it now, and they had me roped before I'd got off a second shot. Wanted to know things I didn't have answers to. Bank routes, when I meant to move the rest of the herd. Whether I'd sold paper on the ranch to anybody in town." He shook his head, wincing at the movement. "Left me for the buzzards when I wouldn't talk, or when they figured I truly didn't know what they were after." "That's the third raid on Prentice cattle this season," Willa said slowly, working through what little town gossip still reached her since her fall from grace. "Folks in Rincon have been saying somebody's driving your outfit toward ruin on purpose. Saying you'll be selling out to Garrick Voss inside the year, one way or another." Something shifted in Dahl's battered face recognition, and beneath it a dawning unease. "Voss has made me 2 offers on the West Range already this year. Both times I turned him down flat." He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd cut him loose, something in his expression softened toward something like an apology he did not yet know how to voice. "You knew that. About the raids. About Voss circling." "I hear things," Willa said, "same as anybody scrubbing floors and mending shirts for half the households in Rincon. Funny what a person learns, listening at the edges of rooms nobody thinks to notice her in." He slept through the worst of the fever that came with the wound over the following 2 days, and Willa nursed him the way she had nursed her own father through his last illness years before, patient, unsentimental, refusing to let herself dwell too long on the strangeness of tending the very man who had ruined her name in front of the whole county. There was a grim satisfaction in it, she admitted to herself in the small hours, sitting up with a basin and a rag while he muttered fevered nonsense into the dark. Whatever else came of this, Dahl Prentice would know, when he was well enough to know anything, exactly whose hands had kept him breathing. On the 3rd day his fever broke and his mind cleared enough for a longer conversation, and it was then, watching her change the dressing at his shoulder with the same careful competence she'd shown from the start, that he finally asked the question that had plainly been sitting behind his teeth since the canyon. "Why'd you do it? Truly? Don't tell me it's simple decency, Miss Sutter, because simple decency doesn't explain a woman walking 2 miles out of her way past a man who cost her everything, and stopping." Willa set down the linen and met his eyes squarely. "I've asked myself the same thing most of these 3 days. I believe it's because I know what it is to be judged unjustly, Mr. Prentice, and I would not wish that same fate, dying alone, roped to a tree, with nobody troubling to ask whether the story told about you was true on any living soul, not even the man who did it to me." His jaw tightened, and something that looked almost like shame crossed his face. "I never asked you a single question," he said low. 6 months back. Foreman Rock came to me with the strongbox short and your name on his tongue, and I took his word for it whole, because he'd worked for my father before me, and I'd never once had cause to doubt him. I never once sat you down and asked you plain whether it was true." "No," Willa agreed. "You didn't. Would it have mattered if I had asked?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But it would have mattered to me, Mr. Prentice, that you thought me worth asking." He did not have an answer for that, and she did not press him for one. Only finished the dressing and left him to sit with it, because some wrongs she had learned could not be mended with an apology offered too quick and too easy, only with time and honesty, and the slow work of proving a changed mind through changed actions. The days that followed settled into a quiet, careful rhythm that Willa had not expected and did not entirely trust. She rose before dawn to change his dressings and make what thin broth her pantry could spare. Worked her mending trade through the daylight hours to keep suspicion from gathering around a house that saw no visitors, and sat with him in the evenings while he told her, slowly and in pieces, about the ranch his father had built and the fear that had crept into him since the raids began. Fear he had covered, she came to understand, with the same hard suspicion that had made him so quick to believe the worst of her. "I've buried more of that outfit's hope than I've let on to anyone," he admitted one evening, Watching the low fire she kept banked against the cost of wood. 3 raids this season, each one worse than the last. I told myself it was bad luck, or careless hands, anything but what it plainly was: somebody working from the inside, feeding information to men who knew exactly which draws to hit, and which nights the hands would be thinnest on the ground. I was so set on finding the leak I never once questioned whether Ruck himself might be it. He'd been my father 20 years. I couldn't see past that. You saw exactly what you wanted to see, Willa said, not unkindly, the same as you did with me. It's an easy thing, trusting the man who's always agreed with you and doubting the woman who never had reason to lie. He looked at her a long moment in the firelight, something working behind his bruised, tired eyes. I don't intend to make that mistake twice, he said finally, with anyone. Least of all you. She did not know, hearing it, whether to believe him yet, but she noticed, turning the words over long after he'd fallen back into an exhausted sleep, that some small guarded part of her wanted to. The trouble came sooner than either of them was ready for it. She had gone into Rincon on the 4th morning for supplies, careful to keep Dahl's presence at her house a secret from anyone who might carry word to the wrong ears, and found the town humming with talk of Prentice's disappearance. Search parties formed and disbanded, the sheriff baffled. And underneath it all, ugly and quiet, whispers that Willa Sutter, who'd been fired off his ranch under a cloud, might know more about the rancher's vanishing than she was letting on. "Sheriff wants a word with you," Mrs. Calloway at the Mercantile told her, not unkindly, but with the particular caution of a woman relaying trouble she wanted no part of. "Just so you know, before you go home today. Somebody mentioned you'd been seen out past the Box Canyon the very morning Prentice went missing." Willa's blood ran cold. If the sheriff came looking before Dahl was strong enough to speak for himself, if word reached Garrick Voss or whoever had set the Rustlers on him that Prentice was alive and recovering under her roof, there would be no second chance to finish what the canyon had started. She hurried home with her supplies half gathered, forcing herself to walk at an ordinary pace through town, despite the panic clawing at her chest, and found Dahl awake and considerably stronger than she'd left him, sitting up against the headboard with color returned to his face. "Sheriff's asking questions," she told him, breathless. "About you. About me being seen near the canyon. If Voss hears you're alive before you're fit to name him plain to the law, he'll finish what his men started, and this time he won't leave witnesses standing to walk 2 miles into town and fetch help." She had not told him the rest of it the way Mrs. Calloway's daughter had leaned across the counter with a knowing look and asked, sweet as poison, whether it was true Willa had been keeping company with a strange man out her place these past days. Whether folks ought to be worried what kind of woman took in a wounded stranger without troubling to tell a soul. Willa had held her tongue and paid for her supplies and walked out with her spine straight, refusing to give the gossip the satisfaction of a reaction. But the old familiar sting of being watched and judged and found wanting had followed her the whole 2 miles home, sharper now for having believed, foolishly, that 6 months of scraping by alone might have worn some of the shame away. It had not. It had only taught her how to carry it without flinching, which was not, she thought grimly, at all the same thing as being free of it. Dahl's face hardened, the exhaustion of the past days burning off into something sharper, more like the man who had once run the largest outfit in the county before Rustlers and a crooked foreman had brought him low. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, testing his own strength with the grim determination of a man who had run out of time to convalesce properly, and found, to his evident relief, that he could stand without the room tilting under him. "Then we don't wait for him to hear it," he said. "We go to the sheriff ourselves tonight, before Voss's men have cause to come looking. I'll swear to Rourke's part in it, to Voss's offers on my land, to every piece of it I can put together, and you'll tell them plain what you heard listening at the edges of rooms nobody thought to notice you in." "You believe me," Willa said, something in her chest going tight and strange at the plain conviction in his voice. "About what I heard. About Rourke." "I believe you," Dahl said. "About considerably more than that, Willa Sutter. And I mean to spend the rest of whatever time I've got making up for the season I spent not believing you at all." They never made it to town that night. Voss's men came instead. 3 riders cutting across the dark toward Willa's small house with the particular purposeful quiet of men who meant business. Having learned likely from the same loose talk at the mercantile that had reached the sheriff that the rancher they'd left for dead in the canyon was very much alive and recovering somewhere close by. Willa saw them first, a flicker of movement against the tree line as she banked the fire for the night, and every drop of blood in her went to ice. "Riders," she said, low and urgent, crossing to where Dahl sat cleaning his revolver with hands still not fully steady from the fever. 3 of them, coming slow, keeping to the shadow of the trees. "I don't believe they're here to wish us a pleasant evening." Dahl was on his feet fast for a man 3 days off a fever, wincing hard at the movement in his shoulder, but moving all the same, checking the loads in his revolver with the grim efficiency of a man who had done this kind of arithmetic before. "Bar the door," he said. "Get down low, away from the windows. I'll not have you standing in the open for their sake. I'm not hiding in a corner while you take on 3 armed men alone with 1 good arm," Willa said, already moving not toward the corner, but toward the old shotgun she kept behind the woodpile for coyotes and worse, a relic of her father's that she knew, from long practice, exactly how to load and fire. "You forget, Mr. Prentice, I've spent 6 months learning to fend for myself with nobody troubling to help me do it. I know this house. I know this land better than any man riding up from Voss's outfit. Bar the door yourself. I mean to make sure there's something worth barring it against." He did not argue further. There was no time, and something in her voice told him plainly that arguing would cost them more than it gained. She doused the lamp, plunging the small house into a darkness she knew intimately, and their attackers did not, and took up a position at the side window with the shotgun steady in her hands, while Dahl held the door and the front approach, and between them they waited in the black, breathless quiet for the riders to close the distance. The first man came around the side of the house first, exactly where Willa had guessed he would, drawn by the darkened window he assumed meant an easy approach, and she put a blast of rock salt and buckshot through the frame close enough to send him reeling back with a howl of pained surprise, more startled than hurt, but startled badly enough to lose his nerve and his footing both. "She's armed," he shouted, stumbling back toward his horse. "Ain't just the rancher in there." The confusion bought them precious seconds. Dahl used them to fling the door wide and put a shot across the second rider's path close enough to spook his horse into rearing, and in the chaos of screaming animals and shouting men, Willa reloaded with hands that had gone perfectly steady, the way her father had once told her they would if she ever truly needed them to, and fired a second warning shot into the dark that sent the third rider scrambling for the tree line in a full, undignified retreat. For a long, breathless moment after the second rider fled, the night went perfectly still, and Willa crouched at her window with the shotgun stock hard against her shoulder, straining to hear past the pounding of her own heart whether the third man meant to circle back once his nerve returned. She heard instead Dahl's low voice from the doorway, steady despite the strain in it. "You loaded?" she confirmed, thumbing 2 fresh shells into the breech with hands that had gone perfectly, coldly steady, the way her father had promised her they would if the need ever came sharp enough. "How's your shoulder? Bleeding again, I expect." "Doesn't signify. I can still hold a door." A grim, exhausted note of something almost like humor crept into his voice. "I'll say this for you, Willa Sutter Rock and Voss picked a poor season to underestimate the woman they'd wronged." "They're not the first to make that mistake," Willa said, "and I don't expect they'll be the last fool in this county to learn it the hard way. It was not, in the end, a battle won by force of arms. It was won by 2 people who knew their own ground better than 3 hired men sent to do a job they had not expected to be so costly, and by the time the riders had regrouped at a safe distance to consider their odds anew, lantern light was already bobbing up the road from town, drawn by the gunfire, the sheriff and 2 deputies riding hard with rifles drawn. Voss's men did not wait to test those odds. They scattered into the dark, and though the sheriff's posse gave chase, only 1 man was run to ground before dawn enough, as it turned out, to unravel the whole scheme once he began talking to save his own neck. The reckoning, when it came fast and complete. The captured rider named Rourke outright, named Voss's money behind the rustling, named the $40 planted in the strongbox 6 months back as Rourke's own doing. Meant to see Willa Sutter turned out of the ranch and silenced before she could report the odd late-night riders she'd once glimpsed crossing Prentice land toward Voss's spread. Dahl gave his account to the sheriff plain and complete, sparing no detail of his own blindness in trusting a foreman's word over a hired woman's honesty. By the time the sun was fully up over Rincon, Garrick Voss was under arrest at his own ranch house, protesting his innocence to a town that had already, in the space of one long night, stopped believing him. Word travelled fast through a town starved for a proper scandal, and by noon the following day, Willa found herself standing on the mercantile steps beside Dahl while the sheriff read Rorke's signed confession aloud to a crowd that had gathered thick along the boardwalk, the same crowd, she noted with a bitterness she could not quite swallow, that had watched her walk out of town 6 months before with her carpetbag and her ruined name and had not troubled itself to ask a single question then. Mrs. Calloway's daughter, who had been so quick with her knowing looks across the counter, would not meet Willa's eyes now. Half the women who had once crossed the street rather than pass too near her found sudden urgent business elsewhere. It was, Willa thought, watching them scatter, a particular kind of justice, not loud, not especially satisfying, but complete in its own quiet way. Willa, sir, the sheriff said, folding the confession and tipping his hat toward her with a formality that felt, after 6 months of whispered suspicion, almost strange to receive. The town owes you an apology it can't rightly pay back in kind. I'm sorry for my part in not looking harder at the truth of that strongbox when it mattered. You looked when it counted most, Willa said, and that's more than most managed. I'll take the apology as it's offered, Sheriff, and be glad to put the rest behind me. Dahl stepped up beside her then, in front of the whole gathered crowd, and did not lower his voice for the telling. I owe considerably more than an apology, he said loud enough to carry the length of the street. I fired an honest woman on a liar's word and let this whole town believe a lie about her character for half a year, because it was easier than asking her to her face whether the accusation held water. That's a debt I mean to spend the rest of my life repaying, starting today, in front of every one of you who ever looked at her sideways on my account. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Willa felt her face heat, unused to being spoken of so plainly, so publicly, by a man who had once condemned her with just as little ceremony. But there was no mistaking the truth in it, nor the steadiness with which he said it, and something in her chest that had stayed clenched tight through 6 long months of scraping by finally, fully released. Willa stood on her own small porch in the grey morning light, exhausted past feeling, and watched the last of the sheriff's men ride off toward town with their prisoners, and found Dahl watching her instead of the departing riders, something unguarded and entirely new in his battered, weary face. Rock's confession clears you, he said, fully. I mean to see it posted plain at the mercantile and read from the church steps if that's what it takes, so there's not a soul left in this county who remembers you as anything but the woman who was wronged and proved it. That would be welcome, Willa admitted, though I find I don't need the whole county's good opinion the way I thought I would 6 months back. I've learned to live without it. I expect I could go on doing so. I'd rather you didn't have to. He crossed the porch to stand before her, favoring his bound shoulder, and there was something in the careful way he moved that told her the words costing him effort had nothing to do with his wounds. I fired you on another man's word and never once asked for your own. I let this whole county believe a lie about you because it was easier than questioning a foreman I'd trusted too long out of habit. You had every reason in the world to leave me roped to that tree, Willa, and you cut me loose instead and nursed me and stood at that window with a shotgun steady in your hands when 3 armed men came to finish what the canyon started. I don't know how a man earns back trust like that. I only know I mean to spend considerable time trying if you'll let me. And what would the trying look like, Mr. Prentice? Willa asked, though her voice had gone soft, the old careful guard she'd built over 6 lonely months beginning, despite herself, to come down. She thought, watching him search for the words, of every reason she'd had to keep that guard raised the humiliation of the firing, the months of averted eyes on the street, the particular loneliness of being the one person in a small town everyone had quietly decided to distrust. She had told herself more than once in those long months that she wanted nothing further to do with Dahl Prentice or his ranch or the good opinion of a town that had been so quick to abandon her. But standing here now, in the ordinary gold light of an ordinary morning, with the man who had wronged her offering not excuses, but a plain and costly accounting, she found that the wanting had never quite left her after all, only waited, patient as the desert itself, for a reason worth trusting again. "It looked like a ranch with your name on the deed alongside mine, if you'd have it," Dahl said, plain and unadorned as the man himself. "It looked like a foreman's job for whoever you trust to run the outfit honest, and a house built the way you'd want it built, and a life where nobody ever again gets to decide what you are without troubling to ask you first. It looked like a man who has finally learned, at considerable cost, exactly what he lost the day he let you go, and doesn't intend to lose it twice." Willa looked at him a long moment, this hard, unforgiving rancher who had wronged her and nearly died for his own trust misplaced elsewhere, who had watched her defend his life and her own with equal steady resolve, who stood now on her small borrowed porch offering not just an apology, but the whole shape of a different future, and felt something in her that had gone hard and careful since the day of her firing finally, fully soften. "I believe," she said, "that I would like to see that ranch, Mr. Prentice, with my name on the deed, as you say, properly, though no more assumptions, no more taking another person's word over mine. If we're to build anything worth having, I'll expect you to ask me plain every time, the way you never troubled to before. I've spent 6 months learning to trust my own judgment above anyone else's say-so, and I don't intend to set that hard-won lesson aside now, not even for you." "Every time," Dahl agreed, and there was something in his battered, grateful smile that told her he meant it down to the bone, a promise made plain in front of the whole waking morning rather than whispered where it might later be denied. "Starting now. Willa Sutter, will you marry me?" She laughed, the first true, wholly unguarded laugh she'd allowed herself in 6 long, lonely months, and said yes, plain and sure and without a moment's hesitation, there on the porch of the small rented house where she had nursed a wronged man back from the edge of dying and found, in the doing of it, a love neither of them had thought themselves entitled to expect. The morning sun came up gold and full over Rincon, over the Box Canyon 2 miles distant, where Rustlers had left a man for dead, over the whole wide unforgiving country that had taught Willa Sutter, in the space of 1 hard season, exactly how much strength a woman could find in her own 2 hands when she chose, against every reason not to use them for mercy instead of vengeance.